My name is Ava Monroe. I'm 31 years old and live in Portland, Oregon. A week before Christmas, my phone buzzed with two messages that changed everything. The first was from my mother. "Don't come for Christmas this year, you'll embarrass us." A few minutes later, my sister Caroline texted, "Ethan hates nobodies. Don't make things awkward." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying with just one word. Understood. What they didn't know was that I owned a $6 million cabin in Aspen, and that on that Christmas night, it would be glowing with light, laughter, and warmth, filled with 150 orphan children who finally had a place to belong. Have you ever been told that you don't belong in your own family? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, before we step into the Christmas night that none of us will ever forget. When people talk about childhood, they usually paint it in colors of laughter, family dinners, and ribbons under the tree. Mine was painted in comparison. My sister Caroline was the perfect daughter, the kind everyone wanted to show off. She had golden curls that caught the light like spun sugar, perfect posture from ballet class, and the kind of confidence that makes adults instantly adore you. Mom would sit in the audience, eyes glistening, while Dad recorded every twirl and bow on his old camcorder. "Our little star," she used to say, clapping until her rings flashed. When the recital ended, the flowers were always for Caroline. I stood beside her holding the bouquet when they needed a family picture, then slipped quietly out of frame once the camera turned off. I never really blamed her. She just played the role they wrote for her: flawless, bright, graceful. I was the footnote that made her perfection stand taller. I wasn't like Caroline. I liked to draw, to take apart broken toys and see how they worked. I preferred books about machines instead of makeup tutorials, and mud instead of mirrors. When Mom found screws and wires on my desk, she frowned as if I'd brought home something indecent. "Girls shouldn't play with junk," she said once, sweeping everything into a plastic bag. "Do something normal. Like your sister." Caroline would look up from her phone, flash me a pitying smile, and say, "She's just different, Mom." It's kind of cute, actually. The word different stuck like a stain. It meant less than. One Christmas when I was 13, the living room glowed with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Caroline sat cross-legged near the tree, unwrapping a small Tiffany box tied with silver ribbon. Inside was a delicate heart-shaped necklace, gleaming like a promise. Mom gasped dramatically, kissed her cheek, and said, "You deserve this, sweetheart. You've worked so hard." I waited for my turn, tracing the patterns on the rug, pretending not to look eager. Finally, a small package with my name appeared at the bottom of the pile. I tore it open and found a plain sketchbook with thin paper, the kind you could buy at the grocery store checkout line. Mom smiled absently and said, "We know you like to draw." That was it. No hug, no pride, just a polite acknowledgement, as if my interests were something to be managed, not celebrated. I mumbled thank you and kept my head down. Later that night, Carolyn posed in front of the mirror, her necklace catching the reflection of the Christmas lights. I sat on the floor beside her, sketching her outline in pencil, quietly realizing that maybe I was never meant to shine in the same room. At 15, I entered the county science fair with a project I'd built from scrap parts in Dad's garage, a small wind-powered generator made from the motor of an old blender. I worked for weeks, soldering wires until my fingers blistered, skipping sleep just to see the tiny fan spin under its own power. When I won first place, my teacher hugged me and said, "You should show your parents, they'll be so proud." That evening, I rushed home, the ribbons still warm in my hand. Mom was setting the table for dinner. "I won," I said, unable to hide my smile. She looked up briefly and said, "That's nice, dear. Just don't make a mess in the garage, okay?" Then she called for Caroline to come downstairs. Caroline had just been voted captain of the cheerleading team. Within seconds, the whole kitchen filled with clapping and laughter that had nothing to do with me. I placed the ribbon quietly on the counter, between a salt shaker and a napkin holder, and went back to the garage. No one noticed when I didn't return for dinner. That garage became my world. It smelled like oil and cold air, with a thin beam of light that came through the small window above the tool rack. I kept a little radio there, always tuned to static because it was the only sound that didn't interrupt my thoughts. I learned to fix things: fans, radios, the old toaster that no one cared about. Once, I repaired a neighbor's broken lamp and felt a thrill so sharp it almost hurt. It wasn't about the praise, it was about seeing something broken come back to life under my hands. I think that's when I started to understand what creation really meant. It wasn't applause, it was restoration. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I'd hear music from the living room, the soft hum of Christmas carols, the sound of champagne glasses clinking. Through the thin garage wall, I could hear my mother's laugh and Caroline's high-pitched giggle. I'd sit there under the dim yellow bulb, sketching circuit diagrams in my notebook, and tell myself it didn't matter, but deep down, it did. Every smile they shared without me became a quiet promise to myself that one day I'd build a world where no one could tell me I didn't belong. That garage, with its cracked floor and smell of rust, became my first sanctuary, the place where I learned that sometimes being ignored isn't the end of your story. It's the start of your independence. By the time I turned 17, I had already learned that silence was safer than attention. My days revolved around grades, part-time jobs, and the small hum of machinery I built from discarded parts. So, when the letter from the University of Washington arrived, heavy with the embossed seal, I almost didn't believe it was real. A full scholarship for computer engineering, 4 years of tuition, housing, and books completely covered. For a moment, standing on the porch in my worn jeans and oil-stained sweatshirt, I felt like the world had finally cracked open a door just wide enough for me to slip through. I ran inside, letter trembling in my hand, ready for my parents to smile the way they always did for Caroline. Dad was at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. Mom was on the phone with Caroline, talking about her new dance recital. I held the letter out like an offering. "I got in," I said, voice shaking. "Full ride. University of Washington." Dad looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he hadn't heard right. "That's in Seattle, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes," I said, smiling. "They gave me a scholarship. Everything's covered." He folded the paper slowly, sighed, and said, "That's too far, Ava. You should pick something closer to home. Caroline will be lonely without you around." Mom nodded, still half distracted by the phone call. "You don't want to move all the way up there, honey. Think about holidays, family dinners. It's better to stay near us." I waited for someone to say they were proud. No one did. Caroline's laughter spilled through the receiver, light and effortless, as if mocking the moment. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the letter again, reading and rereading the words as if they might disappear. Full tuition, housing provided. The paper felt heavier than anything I'd ever held, not because of its promise, but because of the guilt their words planted in me. Too far, too selfish, too inconvenient. It was strange how easily a dream could start to feel like betrayal. For days I wrestled with it, listening to my parents' small suggestions about community college, pretending to consider their advice, but something in me had already decided. If I stayed, I would shrink until I disappeared completely. When I finally told them I was going, Dad just nodded, a short, resigned motion that meant the conversation was over. "If that's what you want," he said, though his tone made it clear he didn't approve. Mom barely looked up from the kitchen counter. "I just hope you won't regret it," she murmured, wiping her hands on a towel. There were no hugs, no photos, no words of encouragement. Just a quiet acceptance that felt more like dismissal. The morning I left, the air was sharp with frost. The suitcase by the door was secondhand, its zipper sticking at the corners. Caroline wasn't there. She had a photo shoot for her dance troupe. Dad carried my bag to the car, set it in the trunk, and gave my shoulder a single pat. "Call when you get there," he said. Mom stayed on the porch, arms crossed, her robe drawn tight around her. For a second, I thought she might come closer, maybe even say she'd miss me. She didn't. She just turned and went back inside, letting the screen door slam shut. The drive to the bus station felt endless. Dad kept his eyes on the road, the radio playing softly between us, some old country song about home and mistakes. When we arrived, he parked, left the engine running, and helped me lift the suitcase out. "Be careful," was all he said. I nodded, trying not to cry. "I will." He got back in the car before I even stepped onto the platform. The taillights disappeared into the morning fog, and I stood there alone, the cold biting through my gloves. When the bus finally pulled away, I pressed my forehead against the glass and watched the town shrink into a blur of gray houses and empty streets. For years, that place had defined me, its silence, its favoritism, its smallness. But as the miles rolled by, I felt the leash of expectations snap one link at a time. I wasn't just leaving home. I was leaving the invisible script that had always told me who I was allowed to be. For the first time, the horizon felt wide enough to breathe. I left not just my home, I thought, but the invisible leash that had always tied me there. Seattle greeted me with rain that never seemed to stop. It wasn't the soft drizzle I'd imagined from travel magazines. It was a steady, gray curtain that soaked everything and left the city smelling of metal and coffee. I rented a small room above a Vietnamese bakery in the University District. The walls were thin, and the radiator made a clinking noise every night that kept me half awake, but it was mine. The scholarship covered tuition and a small meal plan, but everything else was on me. I took a part-time job at a dusty electronics repair shop, fixing broken radios and replacing cracked phone screens for cash. My meals were usually the same: leftover slices of cold pizza from the bakery downstairs, or instant noodles eaten straight from the cup while lines of code blinked on my laptop screen. During those first months, I learned how survival could blur into routine. I'd sit at a wobbly second-hand desk, balancing my calculus textbook beside a soldering iron, alternating between homework and customer repairs. The city outside glowed with neon reflections in puddles, but I barely noticed. I was too busy trying to keep up with assignments, with rent, with life. My classmates talked about weekend ski trips and summer internships their parents had arranged. I talked to no one. But in that solitude, something began to form, a small, stubborn idea that maybe I didn't have to wait for someone else to open a door. Maybe I could build one. It started as a class project, a program that mapped delivery routes to minimize wasted time and fuel. While everyone else built simple apps for groceries or parking spots, I wanted to tackle something bigger. I spent nights testing algorithms until dawn, my fingers trembling from caffeine and lack of sleep. When I realized the model could apply to medical supplies, tracking shipments between hospitals, pharmacies, and labs, I felt a flicker of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I called it Vector Route, a name that sounded almost too ambitious for a single line of code. After graduation, I turned that project into a company, if you could call it that. My office was a corner table at a 24-hour cafe near Pike Street, where I bought one coffee and stayed until closing. I'd sit there at 2 a.m., headphones on, laptop glowing in the dark, pretending the hum of the espresso machine was the sound of an empire being built. I maxed out 2 credit cards to pay for servers and web hosting, printed my own business cards on cheap paper, and sent out cold emails to anyone remotely related to hospital logistics. Most didn't reply. Some did, politely, then disappeared. Every no hurt, but I'd already been invisible most of my life. Rejection didn't scare me anymore. What scared me was staying small. The breakthrough came a year later. A small regional hospital in Spokane replied to one of my messages. Their supply chain was a mess: late deliveries, expired stock, wasted resources. They agreed to a 1-month trial of my software. I didn't sleep the night before the system went live. I sat in my cramped apartment watching the server dashboard, waiting for the first shipment update to register. When the green checkmark finally appeared, I exhaled so hard it felt like I'd been holding my breath for years. By the end of that month, delivery efficiency had improved by 18%. They signed a year-long contract, and for the first time, Vector Root Technologies had a real client. I used the payment to upgrade my equipment, pay off debt, and move into a slightly larger studio one with a window that overlooked an alley instead of a brick wall. The success was small, but it felt monumental. I kept working, adding new features, refining the code, reaching out to more hospitals. Still, I was my own engineer, marketer, and accountant, juggling spreadsheets and sleepless nights. I missed birthdays, skipped meals, and forgot what weekends felt like. But every time fatigue whispered, "Quit," I'd remember that girl in the garage back home, soldering broken wires under a single bulb, waiting for someone to notice. Now I didn't need them to notice, I just needed to keep going. Then the world changed. The pandemic hit like a tidal wave, drowning every routine, breaking every system. Hospitals were running out of masks, ventilators, basic supplies. Trucks were stranded, warehouses overwhelmed. I still remember the night my phone rang. It was the logistics director from Spokane. His voice shook as he said, "We can't track what's going where. Can your system handle statewide demand?" I didn't know if it could, but I said yes anyway. Within 48 hours, I repurposed Vector Root to monitor every shipment of medical supplies across Washington. When deliveries started reaching hospitals on time again, word spread fast. More states called. More hospitals joined. Soon I was working 18-hour days, guiding a small remote team of programmers I'd hired through LinkedIn, none of us sleeping, all of us driven by one thought: keep people alive. By the end of that year, Vector Root was integrated into multiple healthcare networks. I would wake up to headlines about supply chain failures in other industries while our dashboard quietly showed green lines of successful deliveries. It wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets, code, and exhaustion, but for the first time, what I'd built mattered. I'd gone from cold pizza in a basement apartment to the nervous system of an entire state's medical logistics. Yet, even then, when I called home out of habit, no one answered. No congratulations. No. "We saw you on the news." Just silence, heavy and familiar. I hung up and smiled to myself anyway. I didn't need their applause anymore. The sound of my own typing was enough. At 27, I signed the papers that changed everything and, in a way, nothing at all. 70% of Vector Route Technologies went to a pharmaceutical conglomerate for a sum I still had trouble saying out loud: $118 million. The acquisition meeting took place in a downtown Seattle boardroom with glass walls and a skyline view. The lawyers shook my hand, the executives congratulated me, and when it was over, I stood by the window watching the gray city stretch below like a circuit board. It should have felt triumphant, but what I mostly felt was quiet and exhausted kind of stillness that didn't resemble joy. I had thought success would sound like applause. Instead, it sounded like the hum of the air conditioner and the click of my pen. The following week, articles appeared online. Young engineer revolutionizes medical logistics. Meet the woman behind the supply chain that saved lives. My inbox flooded with interview requests, partnership offers, congratulatory emails from strangers. Yet my phone, the one with the family group chat, remained silent. I waited a few hours, then a few days, telling myself maybe they just hadn't seen it. But deep down I knew better. A week later, I finally received a text from my mother. For a brief second, my heart lifted. Then I read it. "We're so proud of Caroline's new apartment. It's in the best neighborhood. You should come see it sometime." Nothing else, not a single mention of what I'd done. I stared at the message, then placed the phone face down on the counter. The irony almost made me laugh. I had built a company from nothing, and somehow I was still the one left off the family newsletter. That night, I poured a glass of wine and scrolled through the news articles about the sale. My name appeared in bold headlines next to words like innovation and entrepreneurship. Reporters quoted my statements about efficiency and compassion in healthcare logistics. It all looked glossy and impressive, but none of it felt real. I thought of the girl who once soldered wires in a freezing garage just to feel useful. That girl would have given anything for a single nod of approval from her parents. Now she was sitting in a penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Union, and approval still hadn't come. I wondered if some voids were simply unfillable. I flew to California for a technology conference where they presented me with an award for outstanding contribution to public health. Cameras flashed, executives clapped, someone handed me a bouquet of lilies. The next day, the same photos appeared on business magazines, my face half smiling under the bright lights. I sent one to my parents, without comment. 2 days later, Mom replied with a picture of Caroline standing in front of her new apartment door, holding a "sold" sign. The caption read, "She did it all on her own." I didn't respond. I just turned off my phone and sat there, listening to the city outside, the low murmur of traffic, the distant wail of a ferry horn. For the first time, I understood that recognition from them might never come. No matter how high I climbed, I would always be standing in the same shadow, the one shaped like Caroline's perfection. It wasn't anger that settled in me that night, but something colder, sharper, clarity. Their approval was never the currency I was meant to earn. My life didn't need their validation to be real. I looked out the window at the skyline. I'd built my life against each light in every tower, proof that you could build a world of your own and still be unseen by the people who once defined you. I whispered the words I'd avoided for years, not as resentment but as truth. To them, I'll always be the other daughter. And for the first time, that truth didn't hurt. It just set me free. After the sale was finalized and the world labeled me successful, I began to crave something quieter, something that wasn't measured in numbers or headlines. Seattle felt too crowded, too polished, too performative. I wanted silence. Real silence. One afternoon, while scrolling through listings online, I found a 40-acre stretch of untouched land in Marble Ridge, Colorado. It sat on a gentle slope facing the Elk Mountains, where snow lingered late into spring and the air smelled like pine and solitude. The listing photos were grainy, just a frozen meadow and a scattering of spruce trees, but something in it called to me. I booked a flight the next day. The moment I stepped onto that land, I knew. The wind moved through the pines with a low, steady hum, and beyond them rose the jagged peaks, their edges dusted in white. There was no cell signal, no noise but the crunch of snow beneath my boots. Standing there, I could almost hear the echo of my own heartbeat. I decided right then I would build something here. Not a mansion to show off, not a vacation home to impress investors, something that felt like breathing. Construction took nearly 2 years. I designed every inch myself with a local architect, sending sketches and notes scribbled in pencil. I wanted redwood timber, not steel or glass towers. The main cabin stretched wide, its beams cut from trees that once grew nearby. The facade was anchored by gray stone and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the changing colors of the mountains. When the sun rose, light poured through the glass like liquid gold, painting the interior in soft amber. In the evenings, the same glass reflected the snowy peaks, turning the cabin into a mirror of the world outside. Inside, I built 12 bedrooms, each one with a wide window seat and a single armchair. I told the architect, every room needs a place to sit and just exist. Those seats became my favorite part, tiny sanctuaries for whoever might someday visit. The kitchen was open and warm, with oak cabinets and a black marble island, polished smooth as a river stone. The smell of pine always mingled with something else, cinnamon, orange peel, or the faint smoke of the fireplace that dominated the great hall. Its stone was hewn from the same quarry as the mountain itself, rough and gray, stretching all the way to the rafters. When it burned, the sound of crackling logs filled the air like music. Behind the house, I had an artificial lake carved into the frozen earth, a small oval pond that mirrored the sky in summer and turned into a sheet of blue ice in winter. I stocked it with trout and left a wooden bench nearby. In the evenings, when the wind dropped, the surface of the water became perfectly still, reflecting the stars so clearly it looked as if the universe had spilled across the ground. Some nights, I'd wrap myself in a blanket, sit by that lake, and think about the girl who used to draw dream houses in a 10-cent sketchbook. Everything about the cabin carried intention. The long dining table made from a single slab of walnut, where I imagined someday gathering people who had nowhere else to go. The library alcove filled with old engineering manuals and novels I'd collected from thrift stores. Even the stair rails hand-carved pine, smooth beneath the touch, were reminders of hands that built something real. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't excess, it was proof of presence. When the final nails were set and the workers packed up their trucks, I stayed behind for the first night alone. The cabin still smelled of sawdust and fresh varnish. I lit the fireplace, pulled a blanket over my shoulders, and walked barefoot across the wooden floor. Every footstep echoed softly, like a heartbeat through the walls. Outside, the snow was falling in thick, silent flakes, layering the balcony railings and the pines until the world turned white. I opened the window and let the cold air drift in. I looked around not as someone admiring wealth, but as someone who finally recognized her own existence. Every beam, every brick, every pane of glass felt like a piece of me stitched together after years of being unseen. For so long, I'd been the quiet daughter, the afterthought, the shadow of Caroline's perfection. This cabin was the opposite of all that. It didn't need anyone's applause. It didn't need to fit into someone else's idea of success. It stood here because I willed it to. When dawn came, the mountains glowed pink and gold. Light streamed through the windows, touching the grain of the wood, the black marble counter, the soft curve of the leather chairs. I sat at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee, watching steam curl upward into the morning. It was then that I whispered aloud, as if the mountains were listening. This cabin isn't luxury, it's a declaration. That I exist. From that day on, I never called it property. I called it sanctuary. Marble Ridge wasn't an escape, it was the first place in my life that felt like mine. Winter arrived like a whisper this year, soft at first, then relentless. Portland was wrapped in a thin blanket of snow, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of tires against slush. I was sitting by the window of my apartment, hands curled around a mug of tea gone cold, when my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, it would be different this time. Maybe she'd ask if I was coming home. But when I opened it, the words were short and precise, each one slicing cleanly through the air. Don't come for Christmas this year, you'll embarrass us. The breath caught in my throat. I read it again, slower, as if a second reading might soften it. It didn't. Before I could even process the sting, another message appeared, this time from Caroline. Ethan hates nobodies. Don't make it awkward. My thumb hovered above the screen. There was a time when I might have tried to defend myself, to explain, to beg for a place at that table. But those days were gone. I typed 2 words. Understood. And hit send. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the color from the world. I set my phone face down and watched the faint reflection of city lights blur in the glass. The tea on the table had cooled completely, its surface still and lifeless. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of me went quiet, not from hurt, but from recognition. This was the pattern, after all. It had always been. I'd learned long ago that my existence embarrassed them because it didn't fit their picture of perfection. Caroline, with her golden hair, her lawyer husband, her shiny suburban home, that was the Monroe they wanted the world to see. I was just the stray shadow they couldn't quite erase. Without thinking, I scrolled to Miles's number and pressed call. My uncle's younger brother, technically my cousin, but more like a lifeline. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and weary. Ava? What's going on? I laughed softly, though it came out more brittle than I meant. Mom texted. Christmas is small this year. Just Caroline and Ethan. There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. You're not the only one. Even Grandma wasn't invited. She called me this morning upset, confused, said it's the first Christmas in 40 years she's been told to stay home. Oh. I stared at the falling snow until the world outside blurred completely. Even Grandma, I repeated. The words sounded unreal. Even Grandma, he said again. And then I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was sharp, hollow, the kind that comes when you've finally stopped expecting anything different. They've really outdone themselves, I murmured. They wanted small. I guess they got it. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, the apartment dim except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. My eyes landed on the photo hanging by the door, a winter landscape of Marble Ridge, taken just after the cabin was finished. Snow on the roof, smoke curling from the chimney, and the mountains rising behind it like silent witnesses. A place built to be quiet, to heal. But now, it felt like it was waiting for something more. On impulse, I picked up my phone again and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Ava? Grandma's voice came through, thin and gentle, like a candle flame in the wind. Sweetheart, I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you this Christmas. I hesitated, feeling the familiar lump in my throat. I heard what happened, I said softly. Miles told me. She sighed. Your mother said the house will be too full with Caroline's family. Can you imagine? Too full for me. I took a breath. Then come to me, I said. To the cabin. There was silence on the line, and then a fragile laugh. To Colorado? You want this old woman to brave the mountains? I smiled. Not just you. I want to do something this year, something different. There's an orphanage in Glenwood Springs, about 40 minutes from the ridge. 150 kids. They've lost a lot this year, Grandma. What if we gave them a Christmas instead? The silence stretched, and for a moment, I thought she might say no. But then her voice came back, trembling but alive with warmth. Ava, that's the kind of small I wouldn't mind. Yes, my dear, let's do it. When the call ended, I stood by the window again, snow falling thick and steady, soft enough to muffle the city below. My reflection in the glass no longer looked like someone shut out, it looked like someone standing on the edge of something new. I whispered to the quiet room, my voice steady, almost smiling. They wanted small. I'll show them what small kindness can do when multiplied by 150. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside me, a spark had caught, and this time, I wasn't going to let it fade. The next morning, the city was still half asleep under its thin white blanket when I sat at my desk, with a notebook open and a single word written at the top. Christmas. I stared at it for a while, letting the weight of it sink in. Then, with a quiet exhale, I reached for my phone and searched for a number I hadn't called in years. Aspen Foundation. They were the nonprofit I'd secretly donated to back when Vector Root first turned a profit, an organization that cared for orphaned and displaced children across Colorado. I'd always sent the checks anonymously, signing them from a friend who remembers what it's like to be forgotten. This time, I wasn't sending a check. I was calling. The line clicked, and a woman's warm, steady voice answered. Aspen Foundation, this is Ruth speaking. Hi, Ruth, I said, smiling despite my nerves. My name is Ava Monroe. I've supported your foundation before, but this year, I'd like to do something different. Something bigger. There was a small pause on the other end, the kind that feels like the world is listening. Bigger? She echoed. Yes, I said softly. I have a cabin up in Marble Ridge, enough space for a few hundred people. I'd like to host a Christmas dinner for the children under your care, all of them, if possible. When Ruth finally spoke again, her voice trembled with disbelief. You mean, all 150? Yes, I replied simply. All 150. And your volunteers too. 20, maybe more. I'll handle transportation, lodging, everything. I just need your help to bring them there. Allers Day. There was a long silence, then a shaky breath. Ava, this could change everything for them. Some of these kids have never even seen a Christmas tree. Then we'll build one, I said. A big one. Within an hour, we were trading details like old friends, logistics, safety, dietary needs, sleeping arrangements. The plan took shape as naturally as breathing. We set the date for December 24th. I hired 3 shuttle buses from Aspen to Marble Ridge. I made calls to local contractors to prepare the guest rooms and to heat the lodge to a comfortable glow by the time everyone arrived. Next, I reached out to Chef Nora Finch, a local legend in the valley known for her rustic farmhouse feasts. I'd met her once before, years ago, when she catered a charity event for wildfire relief. She had a soft laugh, a sharp wit, and a gift for turning the simplest ingredients into comfort. When she picked up, I said, "Nora, I need your help again. I'm hosting a Christmas dinner for 150 children and 20 volunteers. Can you do it?" There was a brief silence before she let out a low whistle. "That's not dinner, sweetheart. That's a miracle. But yes, I'm in." "Tell me the budget." I smiled. "No budget. Just make it warm, make it taste like belonging." She laughed softly. "Then we'll do roasted turkey, honey, glazed ham, mashed potatoes with garlic cream, spiced cider, and enough apple pie to feed an army. I'll bring my team." While she handled the food, I turned my attention to the cabin. I wanted every inch of it to speak warmth and care, not wealth. I called a local carpenter, Tom, who'd helped during construction, and told him I needed a Christmas tree 14 feet tall, freshly cut pine. He chuckled. "That'll barely fit through your front doors." "I know," I said. "That's the point." 2 days later, the tree arrived, its branches heavy with the scent of winter. I stood in the great hall and watched as Tom and his crew anchored it in place, the top nearly brushing the vaulted ceiling. But instead of decorating it with the usual glass ornaments or glittering lights, I asked for something different. We strung the branches with green wool mittens, one for every child who would walk through the door. Each pair was handmade by women from a nearby artisan collective, the soft yarn dyed in shades of forest and moss. When the last mitten was hung, the tree glowed not with glitter, but with tenderness. For gifts, I refused to buy expensive gadgets or toys that would soon break. Instead, I ordered boxes of hardcover storybooks, fairy tales, adventure tales, and books about courage. Alongside each, I packed a winter coat and a handwritten card that read, "You matter more than you know. Allah." On the back of every tag, I wrote the same line that had once carried me through my loneliest years. From a friend who remembers what it's like to be forgotten. I instructed everyone involved, the drivers, the chef, the decorators, not to mention my name. "No announcements, no donor plaques, no recognition," I said firmly. "If anyone asks, just tell them it's from a friend." As the days passed, the cabin transformed. Firewood was stacked high beside the hearth. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. In the library, I replaced the business books on the shelves with puzzles and coloring sets. In every guest room, I left a small wooden toy or stuffed animal on each pillow, and beside it, a note in my handwriting. "You have a place here." One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Elk Mountains, I stood on the balcony, staring at the valley below. The world was blanketed in snow, and the air was so still I could hear the faint hum of the wind brushing against the trees. For a moment, I felt the ghost of my mother's words, "Don't come for Christmas, you'll embarrass us," echo somewhere in the distance, but it didn't sting anymore. I looked at the glowing windows of the cabin, each one flickering like a promise, and whispered into the cold, "They wanted small. I'll show them what small kindness can do when multiplied by 150. The snow kept falling, soft and endless, like an answer from the universe itself, quiet, steady, and full of grace. By Christmas Eve, Marble Ridge had become a postcard of vast, glistening silence broken only by the sound of snow brushing against pine branches. The sky was an endless silver dome, and the air felt so crisp it almost hummed. Inside the cabin, the fires burned bright, and the walls pulsed with warmth, the smell of cinnamon, roasted herbs, and pine resin drifting through every room. Strings of amber lights lined the windows, and the great tree in the hall stood tall and proud, its branches heavy with green mittens and handmade notes instead of ornaments. The scent of baked apples and butter drifted from the kitchen, where Nora Finch and her team worked like an orchestra, every movement deliberate and graceful. Around 5 in the evening, a soft vibration rolled through the valley engines climbing the ridge. I stepped onto the porch just as the first shuttle bus came into view, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Then another. And another. I felt my breath hitch as the doors opened, and one by one, small faces began to appear, eyes wide, scarves pulled high, mittens clutching one another's sleeves. The air filled with laughter and steam as the first group stepped into the light. Nora came to stand beside me, wiping her hands on her apron. "You ready?" she asked. I smiled, feeling the burn of tears behind my eyes. More than ever. As the children tumbled out, their boots crunching over the snow, their awe filled the space between mountains. "It's so big!" One boy shouted, pointing at the cabin, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "It looks like a castle," said another. The volunteers followed closely behind, their breath forming white clouds as they guided the children up the steps. When they entered the hall, a hush fell over the group. The tree glowed softly, and the fireplace threw honey-colored light across the wooden floor. The children stood still for a moment, looking up at the 14-foot pine with its branches dressed in green mittens. Then, as if some invisible thread snapped, they ran forward all at once, circling the tree, giggling, touching the mittens, whispering to each other. "They're real." A little boy gasped, pressing his cheek to one of the soft woolen gloves. I laughed quietly and knelt down to adjust a strand of lights that had fallen loose. A girl with brown hair, maybe 7, maybe 8, tugged at the hem of my coat. Her eyes were round and curious. "Is this really your home?" she asked softly. I looked at her, then at the glowing faces behind her, all of them discovering warmth like it was something new. "It's ours tonight," I said. She smiled, small and shy, before running off to join the others, her boots squeaking against the polished floor. Nora appeared again, holding a tray of mugs. "Hot cocoa," she called. "With cinnamon and marshmallows." Instantly, the line formed. The air filled with the sound of spoons clinking and laughter bubbling like music. Volunteers moved gracefully among them, handing out scarves, plates of cookies, and blankets for the smallest children. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, it felt like the entire world had leaned closer to listen. By 7 o'clock, dinner was ready. The long walnut table stretched across the hall, covered in white linen and candles flickering like small suns. The smell of roasted turkey, thyme, and buttered rolls filled the room until it was almost intoxicating. Nora stood at the head of the table, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen. "All right, my little snow angels," she said, waving her ladle like a baton. "Time to eat." The children cheered, pulling out chairs that were far too big for them. Laughter and chatter filled the hall as plates were passed around: golden roast chicken, mashed potatoes piled high, green beans tossed with almonds, apple pie steaming at the center of every table. Volunteers moved among them with gentle hands and wide smiles. I took a seat at the far end, watching everything unfold. A boy was telling a joke so bad that 2 girls nearly spilled their cider from laughing. Another child tried to carve his roll with the wrong end of his fork. Across the room, Grandma sat wrapped in a shawl, speaking softly to one of the older volunteers, her eyes glowing with a peace I hadn't seen in years. I realized then how long it had been since I'd seen her truly smile. Halfway through dinner, Nora's assistant dimmed the lights, leaving only the fire and candles. The violinist, a young local musician who'd offered to play for free, began a soft melody. The first notes of Silent Night floated through the room like a prayer. One by one, voices began to join in. It started with a single voice, a little girl near the center, singing shyly, barely above a whisper. Then another child joined. Then another. Soon, the sound grew 150 voices rising together, fragile but clear, filling the wooden beams with light. Their tones wove through the air, imperfect yet beautiful, like something too pure to belong to this world. I stood there frozen, tears spilling freely down my face. Nora stopped beside me, her hand warm on my shoulder. "You hear that?" she whispered. "That's what love sounds like." 1. By the final verse, even the volunteers were singing, the sound swelling, echoing off the stone fireplace until it seemed to reach the mountains themselves. When the song ended, the room was silent again, the kind of silence that hums with life. Then came the applause, wild and unrestrained, followed by laughter, hugs, the kind of joy you can't script. Later, as dessert was served, slices of apple pie and mugs of steaming cider, I noticed one of the volunteers near the window, snapping a picture. She didn't ask permission, but I didn't mind. There was something so honest in the way she framed the scene. The children clustered around the tree, cocoa in hand, faces glowing in the light of the fire. That night, she would post the photo with a caption that read, "An unknown woman in Aspen opened her cabin to 150 orphans this Christmas. Kindness still exists." By morning, it would travel across thousands of screens, a single, blurry image that reminded strangers everywhere what goodness looked like. But right then, none of us knew. We were too busy living it. When the night drew to a close, the children began to grow drowsy. Volunteers led them to their rooms, where small beds waited with warm quilts and toys on the pillows. A few of the older boys insisted on helping stack chairs, while the younger ones yawned and tugged at sleeves. One little girl, the same one who'd asked if it was my home, found me by the staircase. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping her small arms around my waist, "for letting us stay." I knelt and brushed her hair back gently. "No," I said softly. "Thank you for coming." After the last door closed and the hall finally fell quiet, I walked to the balcony. The valley lay in silver silence below, the snow still falling, slow and endless. From inside, faint music drifted through the walls, the laughter that still lingered like an echo of something sacred. I wrapped my coat tighter and whispered into the cold, "This is what Christmas should feel like." Behind me, the fire crackled softly. In the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of the children singing again, muffled now, but clear enough to remind me of one simple truth. Sometimes the smallest kindness can rewrite the story of 150 hearts, and maybe, just maybe, one broken one too. Morning came slowly, filtered through the tall windows in soft gold, the snow outside glowing like crushed glass under the first light. The cabin was still and peaceful now, just the sound of wind brushing against the glass and the faint creak of the wooden beams settling in the cold. I made coffee in the kitchen, still replaying fragments of the night before. Children laughing by the fire, Grandma's face illuminated by candlelight, the sound of silent night echoing through the hall. For the first time in years, Christmas had felt real. Then my phone began to buzz. Once. Twice. Then again, a constant vibration against the countertop that wouldn't stop. I frowned, reached over, and flipped it over. Dozens of notifications lit the screen. My inbox was overflowing, my name trending in tags I hadn't created. A headline from a local Aspen paper glowed at the top of the feed. "Anonymous donor hosts 150 orphans at $6M Mountain Lodge. Kindness still exists." Duh. The photo attached was the one the volunteer had taken. The children clustered around the tree, cocoa in hand, the firelight washing over their faces. The story had already been picked up by national outlets. ABC News, Denver Post, Huffington Chronicle. Each headline carried the same refrain: a mystery woman, a hidden lodge, and a night that restored faith in humanity. By the time I finished reading, the phone was ringing again, not a notification this time, but a call. My mother's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Ava." Her voice burst through immediately, sharp, breathless, threaded with accusation. "Do you realize what you've done?" I said nothing. She barreled on, her voice rising with every word. The entire town is talking about it. They all think we excluded you, that we're the villains in your little publicity stunt. Even Pastor Miller mentioned it in his sermon this morning. I glanced across the table where Grandma Lillian sat, wrapped in her wool shawl, sipping tea, her calm a perfect contrast to the panic pouring through the phone. I set the phone down on the table, pressed the speaker button, and said quietly, "You said keep it small, Mom. So I did, just not the way you imagined." There was a long pause on the line. I could almost hear her trying to steady her breathing. "That's not what I meant, Ava," she said finally, her tone slipping into the kind of strained patience she used when pretending not to sound cruel. "You made us look heartless. You could have told us you were planning something like this. We would have helped organize." I cut her off gently but firmly. "Helped organize? Like you helped when I got my scholarship? Or when I built my company? You've spent my whole life pretending not to see me, Mom. And now you're upset that the world finally did." The fire popped behind me, one sharp crack echoing through the quiet room. Grandma set her teacup down, the sound deliberate. Then, in her slow, steady voice, the one that could silence a room without ever shouting, she said, "Judy, that's enough." There was another pause, longer this time. "Mother," my mom began, but Grandma didn't let her finish. "You spent a lifetime shrinking her," she said, every word clear as glass. "And last night, she gave the world what you never gave her, a seat at the table." For a moment, no one spoke. On the other end of the line, I could hear faint static, the sound of someone swallowing back whatever excuse they were about to offer. Then, quietly, Mom said, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Grandma's tone softened, but her words stayed sharp. "Intention means little when neglect becomes habit. You wanted small, Judy. Ava showed you what small really means, small kindness multiplied until it fills the world." Silence stretched between us. On the other side, I could hear the faint hum of my mother's breath, then my father's voice murmuring something in the background, low and uneasy. I imagined them standing in their kitchen, Caroline and Ethan probably nearby, all of them watching the morning news, realizing too late that the story they'd built for years no longer belonged to them. Finally, my mother sighed, the sound brittle and tired. "You embarrassed us, Ava," she said softly. "You made us look cold." I looked out the window where the snow was still falling in slow, weightless spirals. My voice came out calm. "I didn't make you look like anything, Mom. I just stopped hiding what's always been true." There was a click, a door shutting somewhere far away, and then the line went dead. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hiss of the fire. I stared at the phone still lying face up on the table, its screen black again, silent now. Then Grandma reached over, her thin, wrinkled hand resting gently over mine. "Let it go," she said. I nodded, exhaling slowly. Outside, a new layer of snow began to fall, blanketing the tracks left by last night's buses. The world was clean again, quiet, unburdened. I turned to the window, watching the white drift through the air like feathers, and whispered under my breath, "They wanted small. I gave them something bigger than they could ever imagine." Grandma smiled faintly. "You gave them a story," she said. "But more importantly, you gave those children hope." And in the stillness that followed, as the fire crackled softly behind us, I realized she was right. I hadn't just rewritten my own story, I'd given it away, piece by piece, until it belonged to something far larger than me. A week later, when the noise had finally quieted and the headlines began to fade into softer echoes, I sat at my writing desk inside the cabin and stared at a blank card. The paper was thick, cream-colored, the kind Grandma used for her Christmas letters. I took a deep breath and wrote in clean, deliberate strokes. "Dinner. Immediate family only. No press, no ornaments, just truth. No explanations, no apologies, only that." Then I signed it, Ava, and mailed 3 identical envelopes to the same address in Portland. One for my parents, one for Caroline, and one for Ethan. For days, I didn't think about it. I chopped wood, helped Nora deliver leftovers from the Christmas feast to a nearby shelter, and spent quiet evenings with Grandma Lillian, who now refused to leave Marble Ridge. She said the cabin finally felt like home not because of its beauty, but because of its warmth. It remembers laughter, she said. That's what walls are for. Then, exactly 7 days later, I saw headlights winding their way up the mountain drive. The snow had fallen fresh that morning, soft and untouched, and now it glowed under the beams like powdered gold. I stood on the porch in my wool coat, watching the familiar SUV climb the last curve of the road and stop before the steps. The doors opened one by one, first my father, then my mother, Caroline in her designer coat, and Ethan carrying a bottle of wine, his breath fogging in the cold. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then my mother broke the silence, her voice tight. "This is quite the place, Ava." I smiled politely. "It's quieter than Portland." Action. When they stepped inside, the cabin was glowing with warmth, candles on the table, fire crackling in the hearth, and the scent of rosemary and roasted beef floating in the air. Grandma sat by the window, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. She greeted them with a nod, her expression unreadable. Ethan was the first to wander toward the great hall, looking up at the high beams and stonework. "Wait," he murmured, brow furrowing. "This architecture looks familiar." "This." I turned to him with a faint smile. "Your company did the insulation, didn't it?" His eyes widened slightly. "Yes. Aspen Build Group handled this project 2 years ago. We never knew who owned it, everything went through a private trust." "Right," I said softly. "That would be me." The words hung in the air, like the lingering scent of cedar, quiet but inescapable. Caroline blinked rapidly, her polite smile faltering. My mother cleared her throat and turned to the table. "Shall we sit?" she said, her tone brisk, as if structure could disguise discomfort. Dinner was simple: beef roast, homemade bread, and red wine that Nora had left behind. We ate mostly in silence, the clink of forks and the faint crackle of fire filling the spaces where conversation should have been. Finally, I set my glass down and looked up. "Do you remember," I began slowly, "the Christmas I was 13? My father glanced at me, uneasy. "You'll have to remind us, honey." "Oh. That was the year Caroline got the Tiffany necklace," I said, my voice calm. "And I got a sketchbook. You said it would help me stay busy while she practiced ballet." I smiled faintly, not with bitterness but with recognition. That was also the year I realized being quiet made everyone else more comfortable. Caroline shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking between me and our parents. I continued, not out of spite but because the words had waited too long. Every Christmas was the same. Caroline's achievements filled the room, and mine were polite afterthoughts. "When I won the state science fair, you said, 'That's nice, dear. Don't make a mess in the garage.' When I got my scholarship, you said, 'It's too far, Caroline will miss you.'" My mother's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. My father stared into his glass. The firelight flickered across their faces, guilt softening into something almost fragile. I took a slow sip of wine and continued. "I don't bring this up to blame anyone. I just want you to know what silence costs. You built a house big enough for trophies but too small for truth. I learned to live elsewhere in the spaces you left empty." For a moment, no one breathed. Then, from across the table, Ethan shifted uncomfortably. His gaze had landed on something behind me, the framed photo hanging on the hallway wall. A black and white image of my first warehouse in Seattle, the Vector Route logo faintly visible on a shipping crate. He blinked, leaned forward slightly, and whispered, "Wait. Vector Route Technologies? That's your company?" I met his eyes. "Yes." He froze. "Ava Monroe, the CEO." Caroline turned sharply, her wine glass trembling. "You're his boss?" I looked at her, not cruelly, not smugly, just steady. "Yes, Ethan's division handles regional logistics for us." Then I turned back to the table. "But tonight isn't about status. It's about honesty. No one spoke after that. My father's jaw clenched. My mother stared at the flickering candles, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Caroline sat motionless, her eyes darting between Ethan and me as if trying to rearrange a puzzle that no longer fit. Ethan lowered his head, the realization written across his face that all those years he'd heard Caroline dismiss me as the sister who couldn't hold a real job. I had quietly been signing his company's checks. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was cleansing, like a long-held breath finally released. Grandma's eyes met mine from across the table, soft but proud. After a while, I stood and began clearing the plates. My mother started to protest, but I stopped her with a small smile. "It's all right, Mom, you can sit. Tonight's not about making anyone look bad, it's just about seeing things as they are." When the dishes were done and the fire had burned low, I poured the last of the wine into 4 small glasses and raised mine slightly. "To family," I said quietly. "The one we're born into and the one we learn to build ourselves." They lifted their glasses, hesitant but obedient. The room glowed in the amber light, and for a fleeting second, there was peace, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless, as if the mountains themselves were erasing everything that came before. The night ended without ceremony. No tears, no apologies, just a quiet reckoning that hung in the air long after the plates were cleared. The fire had burned low, leaving behind a soft orange glow that pulsed gently against the cabin walls. My family stood by the door, coats pulled tight, eyes downcast. My father muttered something about the roads icing over. My mother nodded too quickly, clutching her purse like a shield. Caroline said nothing. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, unreadable, a flicker of shame, maybe envy, maybe something like recognition. As they turned to leave, Ethan paused at the threshold. The light from the chandelier caught the snow still clinging to his coat, turning it to silver. He looked at me not the way he used to look at Caroline's sister, but the way one professional sees another. A quiet understanding. "Thank you for the dinner," he said softly. Then, after a pause, "and for showing what respect looks like." I didn't respond right away. I just nodded, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before stepping out into the cold. The door shut behind them, and their footsteps faded into the crunch of snow down the hill. The silence that followed was deep and sacred, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath. I turned back toward the great room. The table was still set, half-empty wine glasses, candle wax running down like tears, the smell of rosemary and bread lingering in the air. It didn't feel heavy or sad. It felt clean, like the end of a storm. Grandma Lillian was still sitting in her armchair by the fireplace, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked up as I approached, her eyes soft but alive, like embers that refused to die out. "You did it, Ava," she said quietly. "You changed the story." I sat beside her, the fire warming my hands. For a long moment, I just listened to the sound of wood popping, the steady rhythm of the wind outside. "I didn't need revenge, Grandma," I said finally. "I just needed peace." She smiled, that knowing, almost mischievous smile she'd carried her whole life. "And you found it. Not by taking from them, but by giving to others. That's what they'll never understand. You didn't build this cabin to prove them wrong. You built it to make room for what was right." I leaned my head against the back of the chair, letting her words settle. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, thick and luminous, blanketing the world in quiet forgiveness. The light from the cabin spilled out through the windows, a soft, steady glow against the dark. It looked like a beacon, not of wealth or power, but of welcome. After a while, Grandma stood and kissed my forehead. "Get some rest, my dear. The world will talk about what you did last week, but I hope you remember tonight. Because peace doesn't always make headlines." Then she disappeared down the hall, her footsteps soft against the wood. I walked to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit my cheeks, sharp but clean, and the sky stretched above me vast, white, and infinite. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the air, melting on my lashes, gathering on the railing like sugar. The mountain beyond was a perfect, endless hush. I stood there for a long time, breathing it in. The quiet, the stillness. The light of the cabin spilling behind me like warmth made visible. And then, in that silence, I heard my own voice calm, steady, carrying across the snow like a promise. You don't need anyone's permission to be seen. Build your own table. And when you do, open it for those who were once left outside. For a moment, I let the words linger in the air, watching as they seemed to drift upward and disappear into the snowfall. I thought of the children's laughter, of the mittens on the tree, of the volunteers singing Silent Night, of every person who had once been told they didn't belong, who now knew there was a table waiting for them somewhere in the world. I smiled to myself, turned back toward the golden light of the cabin, and whispered the final words meant not for them, but for whoever was still listening through a screen, through distance, through silence. Have you ever been excluded by your own family? I asked softly, as if the mountains themselves were my audience. Tell me where you're watching from. This table still has a seat for you. And then I walked inside, closed the door behind me, and let the world outside fall quiet again. A world freshly covered in snow, waiting for morning, waiting for another story to begin.